This is an introduction to moral relativism or ethical relativism. And in particular, we're focusing on subjectivism. So a lot of people have different things in mind when they say the word relativism. Let's make sure we're clear about our terms. Relativism has a positive claim and a negative claim. So the positive claim is that all ethical truths or moral principles are relative to a culture or an individual. So they only make sense when we're referring to a specific culture or individual. On the negative side, there are no universal moral principles that apply to everyone. So relativism involves both of those claims. The type of relativism that says that all ethical truths are relative to a culture is called conventionalism. And this is the most common version, at least among philosophers. And so we'll look at that in much more detail in our separate video on conventionalism. In both cases of conventionalism and subjectivism, there's an index required in order to make sense of moral claims. So with both forms of relativism, this is going to be true because moral principles are not universal. So we're going to need this. So the implication is that ethical claims must have a cultural index or an individual index in order to be meaningful. Now, you may not understand what I mean by saying an index is required, a cultural or individual index. So let's put it in a different context and talk this through. So consider somebody says, oh, my vacation was so wonderful. The travel was relaxing. The culture is fantastic. The food was great. The scenery was so beautiful. And they say all these things, and you're very impressed. But if that's all they tell you, you're left with a question, right? Where did they go, right? You need an index. You need some way of anchoring their claims to a specific place. Otherwise, this is not a very helpful conversation. And the same is true then if relativism is true. So if conventionalism is true and everything's relative to a culture, and then somebody makes a moral claim, such as lying for personal gain is morally wrong, well, that would have to be qualified. Since it's not universal, it would have to be qualified. And so somebody would have to say, well, lying for personal gain is not morally wrong in the 21st century United States, or something like that. Subjectivism in particular is the claim that all ethical truths, or again, moral principles, are relative to an individual. And then we have the negative claim. As we do with all forms of relativism, there are no universal moral principles that apply to everyone. So that is what the claim of subjectivism is. Now, a lot of people initially say that this makes sense. And let's look at a motive for subjectivism. First of all, each person has different tastes and different beliefs about morality. So if we take surveys about what's moral and what's not, we're going to get different responses. So that tends to make people think that maybe subjectivism is correct. And for many people, it seems right to say something like, what's right or wrong for you may not be right for me or wrong for me. So it might be okay for you to do, but not for me to do, or it might be wrong according to you, but it's not wrong according to me. And that is really a way of expressing the first point, right? That people have different beliefs about morality. But when people say that, that kind of motivates this idea that subjectivism is correct. And so often people take this to mean the further point that there is no standard beyond one's individual opinion. So that would be subjectivism, right? All moral claims are just a matter of personal opinion. It's often stated that way. They're relative to the individual. and there are no standards that apply to everyone. This may sound intuitive, but it is problematic. So there are some problems for subjectivism, and I'm going to focus on 3. First of all, it conflicts with some really basic moral intuitions. So what we want to do is to think carefully, if subjectivism is true, what follows from that? Well, one thing that follows from that is that suicide bombers like the ones on 9/11, the Columbine shootings in the late 90s, and all the mass shootings since, well, maybe not all of them, but mass shootings since, like the El Paso shooting, where somebody kind of had this white nationalist manifesto, and so they were shooting immigrants, right? These perpetrators of violent crimes would be morally right? These people were believing that what they were doing was true. We know this from Klebold and Harris, because Klebold kept a journal, and he talked about how he thought it was going to be morally right to go and shoot his innocent classmates. And we have this writings and statements of these perpetrators that say what they were doing was morally right. They believed it was morally right. Well, if subjectivism is true and everything is relative to the individual, then what they did was, in fact, morally right. Shooting innocent people in these cases becomes morally right as a matter of consequence of the tenets of subjectivism. But most people just simply can't believe that that's morally right? There's moral outrage when these events happen. A second problem for subjectivism. Subjectivism implies that it's impossible to disagree about morality. But of course it is possible. So here's one case. So consider this example, a case of borrowed money and not returned. So say somebody borrows $50 from you. They say, I really need it. I'm going to get paid on Monday. I'll pay you back then. So you go ahead and you give them $50. You see them on Tuesday. You said, hey, you said you're going to get paid yesterday, Monday. And so could I have my $50 back? And they say to you, no, this is something I just do. I'm not going to give you your money back. I think it's right for me to be in control of as much money as I can. So I just go around and get money by whatever means possible. I lie, I cheat, I steal, and then I do with the money what I think is best. Now, you would say that's morally wrong, I presume. But the other person says, no, it's morally right for me to do this. Now, what are you disagreeing about? If subjectivism is true, all you can say is that it's morally wrong for you to take money from somebody, promise to repay it, and then not give it back. It's just a statement about you. But the other person, you can't make a judgment about the other person, because what's morally right or wrong for them is solely dependent on what they believe, right? So this doesn't make sense, of course. It seems to show pretty clearly that subjectivism is problematic. It's false. One other problem for subjectivism, it implies that everyone's moral judgments are always correct. Now, you may say that, I believe my moral judgments are always correct. Well, let's think about this more carefully. Suppose, well, let's look at this example. They're simply not, right? Not everyone's moral judgments are correct. And here's one way of thinking why not. Because we sometimes change our beliefs about morality, right? And then when we do that, we admit or we think, we believe that we were wrong in the past. So for example, a couple examples, Norma McCorvey was the original Jane Roe who brought the case of Roe versus Wade. So she fought for a right for her to have an abortion. Now, Years later, she has come to believe that abortion is morally wrong. So at one point in her life, she believed it was morally acceptable, permissible to have an abortion. Now she believes it's morally wrong to have an abortion. Well, which is true, right? Just the fact that she believes she's morally wrong is she's making a judgment about herself that she was wrong in the past. But if morality is entirely dependent upon the individual and what they say is right or wrong, then it would have to still be wrong in the past. Suppose we have a slave owner during the 1800s in the United States, and he becomes converted, as some of them did, and then began to believe that he should release his slaves, as some of them did. And because of religious beliefs, they decide, this is wrong, I shouldn't have slaves. I used to think it was okay. Now I believe it's not okay. Well, what are we doing? We're saying that my judgments previously were wrong, but you can't make that claim if subjectivism is true. So anytime somebody changes their mind about a moral belief, a moral judgment, then that's showing that subjectivism fails. So that's a third and the final problem with subjectivism that we'll discuss. The other form of relativism is conventionalism, as I mentioned. So look at the video on conventionalism to find out more about that.